Let's try again. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you again for joining us. This is our second last session for today. Again, welcome from Namibian House. We're broadcasting from the World Economic Forum in Davos this week. And as you can see, a star-studded lineup. And I think you'll see the theme for this afternoon is Namibia's renewable energy and green hydrogen potential, and how Namibia's private sector can participate in this energy, not only transition, but this large energy dream the country has. To start this afternoon's discussion, I would like to introduce our first speaker. He's the chairman of the Green Hydrogen Council. He is also the Director General of the National Planning Commission. Honourable Orbit Kanjorde, please, if you would take the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Director of Proceedings. You have known me as not having lots by way of presentations or a written narrative to speak from, but I'm going to try and do my best. I have huge slides, but I'm not going to show them to you. I'm just going to run through renewables, energy self-sufficiency, the policy framework, and how that liberalized to allow independent power producers. Then obviously there was the time of renewable feed-in tariff projects, 15 or 14 of those, each about 5 megawatts, that allowed, and actually was the springboard of the start of renewables. And then obviously the current generator and distributor of power, and whatever reform took place in NamPower as the actual entity, and how its role as a supplier and generator, distributor of power to the rest of the nation, that came about. Our import portfolio, which by now we all know, and how the renewables actually took a dent in changing that framework. And certainly the latest of all renewables to get there is the green hydrogen prospects. And I wonder if that, we've spoken a lot around that. Maybe the word green hydrogen in itself is ringing all kinds of musical tones in our ears, brains, and lips, and tongues. But be that as it may, back in 2015, I was the Minister of Mines and Energy, 2015, 16, 17, till 18 February 26. That's when my portfolio changed for where I am today. And much of that period was really putting in place the necessary policy frameworks in terms of the renewables. So the regulatory framework is, of course, at the policy level, is the Ministry of Mines and Energy. And it's many set of policies, all the renewable policies, IPP policies, and all other legislation, and the Electricity Act, the National Energy, NEF law, and many of that. So then, of course, the draft bills from electricity to energy regulator. So that framework really saw a paradigm shift in that period, and it continues thereafter. Life doesn't stuck with me being there, it's moved on. So many of the policies have actually taken hold. Then obviously the Electricity Control Board, which in itself is aiming to be the energy regulator. Maybe it can take on more than it actually currently can do. So much of the directives, guidelines, licensing issues in terms of all of these activities in the renewable space, in the conventional electricity space, and of course, the current discussions around green hydrogen. It's still the mandate ministry, still does all that work. The market participants, after all of the reforms and policy enactment that actually took place in the period 2015 to just about now and still continue to change that space, that regulates the entirety of the market space. And the realization of energy or power, electricity self-sufficiency was a key driver. For a country to have at some stage imported more than 60% of its energy base, it was like putting all your eggs in one basket. At some point, Eskom and whoever we bought power from, and I remember during my tenure, they would simply say, look, it's tough at home. And I remember the period just before 2014, 2015, and that's when we began to negotiate real, almost fixed terms with Eskom, because the previous year or two before, when they were in a stringent load shedding period, they would give us a check, go find power somewhere. And I remember 2015 in that period, of course there were other human factors at play. You would sit in a hall like this and suddenly it goes dark. So it turned out it wasn't really the supply case, as it were. It was more than just a supply case, if you understand what I mean, by its very own. So a lot of the potential then, we began to understand that Namibia had wind and solar, very, very serious capacity factors, and we didn't quite know the numbers. But then the interest started taking off. The renewable feed-in tariff projects were designed before I got to be a minister. And there were supposed to be about 20 odd of them. But the negotiations and the playing field kept evolving, and a number of small players, especially the medium small enterprises who were the core concentration of this, the investment capacity in terms of per single 5 megawatt project, to raise 10 million to a small player in Namibia was not just quite a task. It was almost below the threshold of any investor wanting to participate. Too small sort of framework. The pricing, where it started to where it ended today, you know that curve kept going in the opposite direction, not just simply because electricity was getting a lot cheaper on a renewable tariff basis. So that changed the numbers from the very initial design of any one of those 5 megawatts projects to a factor of about 14 that became the final number that we relied on. And you can imagine the strain, the stresses in the market at the time. So we took, as a government, we took that, and partly NamPower as well. There was a lot of friction in that period. So the number of policies passed were something like 5 or 6. The first one was the General Energy Policy. And that was passed in 2017. The same year, the Renewable Energy Policy. And I think these are frameworks that would be very good for all of you to have. The next was the Independent Power Producer Policy. In fact, the debate became so seriously directional to government because NamPower remained stuck on, we are the legitimate guys to play in we could generate, we could wheel the power, we could transmit, we could do just about much of what the market would determine, and we had all our eggs in one basket as well. So the independent power producers concept then one of the ministers before my time simply argued, look, if you can't toe the line with the objectives of the government of the day, then we could as well look somewhere else for solutions, because we need to move the bracket of power dependency we are in from South Africa, Mozambique, Zambia, and all of those countries. And obviously that became the basis point of how government began to change its approach in its dependency from its power agency, which is non-power still. And that actually created the fertile grounds for the IPP policy. And we moved on very swiftly in there, and we assessed, at the time, we assessed the field of play and the potential that existed, especially in 2016, when we convened a renewable energy sort of gathering with the market, and we spoke to some like 20, 25 companies back in the day. And much of that consultation became the input in the policy. So there was real going to the ground by government, and much of the policy reflected the feeling on the ground. And then the government decided, look, let's move on with that policy. The National Integrated Resource Plan, the NIRP, I'm sure is still work in progress, but it's significantly advanced in its advocacy for what power should, or in the power supply should be looking like, let's say, 2040, 2050 and beyond. So you can understand now that back before 2015, much of what we now have wasn't in operation at the time. So the government has significantly moved to address the dependency on others for power. And obviously the dynamics with the load shedding, today the sources of current power, be it fossil fuel dependent, coal in our case, it's a material case for why green hydrogen has taken the argument a step further in our context. So much of the many projects that then followed dictated that the government must, out of all of these policy goals, what is our target? It's for us to become energy self-sufficient or secure. Much of those policies were actually aiming for that. And to be able to do that, we have the sun and the wind. Why would they not form part of the mix? That's one target. For us to become energy secure is to leverage those two resources, the sun and the wind. So, and today, I'm proud of the fact that these policies are working policy documents and legal frames of government. And we are on the cusp of cutting even higher ground. At some point, there has to be some policy around cleaner fuels. It's inevitable. We have to be, at some point, talking around the impact of what green hydrogen is going to actually be doing, to the extent that the many pillars constitutionally providing the confidence to the investors, that needs to now hone down to some piece of legislation around cleaner fuels in some shape or form. Some of the issues that we may need to address in that policy directive would be certification, standards. Not every bit of hydrogen that you produce can actually cut it in the greener fuels type space. Much like the blood diamonds have been regulated with a tracing system. Think of that. Where does that diamond come from? You remember the Naomi Campbell development not so many years ago. You get a gift, a big diamond, and then it's its tracing tells you where it originated from, and all the human rights issues to do with that. So at some presentation in France, this was a huge discussion. The color of gray, green, blue, pink, I don't know what else we call it, it's not sufficient in the classification of whether or not you cut the cloth for green hydrogen. And I think Namibia, having raised the awareness and its potential in this space, will be called to cut a step further if we are to meet some of these demands. Also, part of the goals is to make renewable energy a vehicle of income generating opportunities. Today, there are participants in this room who've actually entered that very frame, and they play that space. Namibians who've teamed up with international companies, be it in the refit space or renewable projects themselves at 20 megawatts, 30 megawatts, and so on. So that is beginning to realize that inclusivity to the rest of the population in its diversity must play a role and take ownership in the space of renewable energy. Fourthly, for us to become a regional leader in the development and deployment of renewable energy within Southern Africa, and the energies in the space, green hydrogen, back in sub-Saharan Africa, with us having become, or is one of the case study countries, tells you that this dream is a reality we can actually feel, touch, and maybe get there sooner rather than us thinking it is still some time off. To enable power exports through regional integration, we can't play it alone, clearly. We need off-takers, we need large industries, developed economies to come help play and hold our hands. We are already finding deficiency in the legal framework space. We don't have what it takes. I can't go to a piece of law or policy and talk to you about the entirety of the impact of green hydrogen. Least do we even have some knowledge about the downstream industries. For now, we are playing the upstream until such time that those pilot projects come to fruition. We still would need some work to do. But all the subsequent industrialization activities that will, by some shape, form, or size, take effect, we're not quite sure, and how do we regulate that? Our research from Harvard Growth Lab with Professor Hausman and ourselves tells us that we don't have the necessary skills to anticipate once that industry start taking shape. The job numbers we have a feeling for, who will migrate back next to the source, and how do we deal with those new dynamics? The Investment Act, yes, it's there, it protects you. But companies seem to indicate right now they need much more than just what we can give. What is it? It's not clearly discernible to us. So government needs to study that space and come out and say, look, this is how I see the unfolding development of that industry going forward. For now, let me leave it at that, and the call is simple. That market is growing. That market has evolved from what it used to be. It actually has evolved to about 150 megawatt space of renewables that actually are fitting into the grid as we speak. So there's still space. We know the potential. We've mapped it out. We understand that. With piloting coming in between the current Hyphen project and that of projects between the German government and ourselves, I think the future remains highly, highly fertile for more projects. And if the numbers come in, both especially from a net export position, if the numbers come in both from the mode of transport and where the bigger markets are, you can imagine. the numbers also shown, and it was shown by Tobias from Hyphen, that look, when you do and make the first investment, time free at 30 years, the sun still remains, the wind still remains, that keeps rolling itself fast forward. So the policy environment inevitably has to keep coping. The dynamics will keep changing. So we have it cut out for ourselves with a future that looks like it's been defining for inclusive prosperity and ownership of locals. I leave it at that.
Thank you, Honourable Kanjorde, for that insightful mapping of the domestic industry. I think as a investment professional, it certainly makes me very excited to know that, or to understand at least, the scope of the possibility in the region, and definitely the potential there is for domestic operators to partake in the market. But without further ado, I would like to really invite our next guest. He's not an unknown person in Namibia. He's in fact the founder and the executive chairman of Otesa International. Otesa International is a regional civil engineering and renewable energy company. Their founder, Elmo Kayamo, is a well-known figure in Namibia's business community. And in addition, they're also operators of renewable energy projects in Namibia already. So I can think actually of no one better to really highlight the opportunities in this particular market or in this particular environment than Elmo's. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us, Elmo.
Thank you very much, Moderator Francois. A warm welcome to everyone, especially those that are present here and those that are also attending virtually. It's really an honor and privilege as a Namibian, very proud Namibian, to be here at the Namibian House in Davos, and obviously to be presenting together with the Director General. I think I'll also want to give a special thanks really to His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Namibia, for enabling the private sector companies to be part of this exciting journey and to come and showcase our potential. And then also a big thanks to Mrs. Nangula Uwanja and her team for really hosting such an excellent event. I'm going to touch base, obviously, on Namibia's renewable energy. I think we are possibly the proof of concept in Namibia, as the Director General has put it. Before I delve into our presentation, I would just like Leon, please, to showcase a corporate video just to show in terms of who we are.
As one of Namibia's leading civil engineering construction companies, Otesa's forte lies in its ability to provide a comprehensive range of civil engineering construction services. Our corporate roots coincide with Namibia's development as a modern nation. Our strategy has consolidated a workforce that has promised on the reputation of producing the best roads in Africa. Our corporate roots allow us to continuously strive towards the demands of a changing era and people's aspiration for the future through world-class construction operations. With vast state-of-the-art resources and established procedures, we help shape and redefine Namibia's horizons. We're not just any civil engineering construction company. We are Otesa Civil Engineering, engineering the nation's progress.
All right, Thank you. That's basically just a snapshot in terms of what we do as a company. Just to delve into my presentation, I'll be giving a small overview about Otesa, and then also touch a bit on Namibia's renewable energy. The Director General has also touched quite extensively on the regulatory framework. I'll also be touching on the role of the private sector, and then also give you a bit of a case study in terms of what we are doing in Namibia. Otesa is a proudly Namibian company. Our headquarters are in Windhoek, Namibia. We recently opened offices in Cape Town, South Africa, and then another office in London, United Kingdom. Our core business is predominantly in infrastructure development. That's where we started off as a company, primarily in road construction. And then we diversified into renewable energy and then the ICT space. We are one of the top 3 largest contractors in Namibia. As you are aware, Namibia has the best road infrastructure and is ranked in Africa, and is also ranked number 23 globally. So we've got world-class roads in Namibia, and as a company, we are very much proud and happy to be associated with that achievement. We have also placed ourselves to be one of the leading Pan-African companies capable of carrying out multi-million-dollar projects. We have recently been exploring opportunities as well in Uganda. In fact, we have been invited in Uganda to look at the possibility of building road infrastructure projects, and then also to look at the renewable energy. Uganda is one country that produces a lot of electricity, but 30% of that goes to waste because they don't have what we've got, the infrastructure, your transmission network. That is one thing that they have a challenge with. As a company, we employ over 1,000 employees across all our projects. In fact, we will be starting a new project very soon in South Africa, in East London. We will be building a tunnel through the mountain together with another consortium. Now, I think the topic here is really about renewable energy. I don't want to really talk much about road infrastructure. It's really about energy. I think with the war in Ukraine, I think we have all seen how the cost of electricity has gone up and how every country has been trying to scramble around coming up with alternative solutions to energy. Energy is the lifeblood of any global economy, and so is it a lifeblood also for Namibia. Global energy costs have really been rising as demand increases. Many factories have now been opening after COVID-19. And if we as a country are going to keep these prices down, we will have to look at a long-term solution. And then we need to have a flow of energy that is, number one, affordable, number two, that is clean, and number three, that is secure for the future. That is critical. We need a power supply that is made in Namibia. To do this, we have to take advantage of Namibia's untapped resources of wind, yes, and sunshine. I think the Director General has also spoken extensively about this. Namibia has got the best, or second to Chile, in terms of sun radiation, so definitely this is an untapped resource. Now, I'm not going to delve much on green hydrogen. I think my brother James has spoken quite extensively for the past 3 days. I don't want to be sending out conflicting messages, and then tomorrow I'm back on the next flight. So I'll rather leave that to James to discuss. But I think the critical issue here is really to indicate that in terms of the Harambee Prosperity Plan, it has been noted that there is a shortage of adequate supply of energy, both locally and regionally. This challenge was also obviously underlined by the Net Zero report of 2050, which noted that sectors like cement, steel, chemicals, road trucking, container shipping, aviation will need green hydrogen if the world is to remain on course to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And I think Namibia as a country is better positioned resource-wise, as well as having the political will to do so. I think you will agree with me that His Excellency the President has been part of the sessions for the past 2 days on green hydrogen and also opportunities in Namibia. So that's a clear indication that there is a political will to basically fast track renewable energy in the country. To produce renewable electricity and green hydrogen competitively, a country will need a world-class transmission infrastructure. Very important. It has to have also international port facilities, a world-class wind and solar resources, lots of land, and a conducive legislative environment. I think with the previous presentations, especially from NAMPORT, this was really showcased, and this basically confirms to the fact that we will have to, as a country, we will have to have all these ingredients. And I can confirm that Namibia as a country has got all these ingredients. Renewable electricity and green hydrogen will provide Namibia with a real opportunity to attract meaningful employment, direct investment, and also to diversify its export market. Namibia currently imports about 60% of its electricity consumption needs, mostly also from South Africa or from the Southern African power pool. To reduce the reliance on imports, Namibian government has incorporated a renewable energy strategy for short-term and long-term development planning, and this has obviously been highlighted by the Harambee Prosperity Plan. Now, the Director General has also discussed now previously about a set of comprehensive policies that have been implemented, and I must say the Director General has actually been the champion of these policies when he was the Minister of Mines and Energy. And I must thank you, Honorable, for really spearheading and championing the implementation of these policies. That obviously includes the Namibia Energy Policy, the Independent Power Policy, the Modified Single Buyer Framework, which is actually, that's the new framework that has recently been implemented. These are all government initiatives to promote renewable energy in the country. As an investor, these policies make our investment safe and secure. And I think a group from Hyphen will attest to that. If we now have to look at the role of the private sector, the private sector plays a major role in the production of energy using renewable resources. A growing number of local and multinational companies continue to invest billions in research and development. If you look at the cost of solar panels now, they've reduced by almost 85%. If you look at the cost of wind, it has also reduced by almost 60%. So there is quite a lot of work going on in terms of research and development to bring the cost of energy down. As a private sector company, we need to build a Namibian energy system that is much more self-sufficient. With the MSB framework, there is really an opportunity for private sector companies to export electricity into the bigger Southern African pool market. There is really a huge opportunity. I think the Director General has also touched on the issue of load shedding, for example, in South Africa. So there is really an opportunity to export electricity. Large private sector operations in steel, cement, chemicals, long-haul transport and maritime shipping and aviation are all being encouraged to make a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. In Africa, this growth has been exponential in the last few decades, with national utilities calling upon independent power producers to build and generate energy from renewable energy sources, backed by, obviously, your power purchase agreements. I think the Director General has also touched on this. Now, the MSB allows larger power users in Namibia to procure part of their requirements directly from independent power producers. And I'm going to give you a case study in terms of this. The MSB project, we as OTESA are the first company as a proof of concept to implement the MSB project in Namibia. And we have done this with the Roshpina zinc mine. We have created an SPV vehicle called Roshpina Solar Park, of which with a max Roshpina Solar Park, which is an SPV that is basically implementing serving as an independent power producer for the Roshpina zinc mine. This SPV is owned 70% by OTESA and 30% owned by Emesco Energy, which is also a Namibian company. The Roshpina Solar Park is being constructed near the town of Roshpina in Karas region of southern Namibia, with the purpose of selling electricity generated under a 15-year PPA exclusively to the Roshpina Zinc Corporation as an off-taker. The Roshpina Zinc Mine is a subsidiary of the Canadian-listed company, Trivali, and Trivali is also listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. The mine itself has been in existence since 1969. They mainly produce zinc and also a minor amounts of copper, silver, and gold. The Roshpina Solar Park will deliver almost 30% of Roshpina's Zinc Corporation's power requirements during the life of the agreement and reduce greenhouse gases emissions for the foreseeable future. We are now currently implementing the first phase of that, which is 5.7 megawatts, which is going to be completed towards the end of the year. Next year, we will be implementing another 10 megawatts. In fact, as part of the mine's expansion, they want to increase their requirements. But in terms of the MSB framework, we are only allowed to sell 30%, it's kept up to 30% of the mine's requirements. But obviously, this policy is now being reviewed. It might even be increased to about, say, 50%. So the Roshpina Solar Park will reduce the annual greenhouse gases emitted in the production of the utility supply power in the region of about 14,000 tons of CO2. We have also registered as an eligible seller within the modified single buyer framework established by the Electricity Control Board, NEMPower, to allow bilateral transactions between eligible sellers and contestable customers in Namibia. So that's very, very important. This project will increase skills levels in the region, in Karas region. It will create about 200 temporary jobs during construction. We are actually currently busy with construction. We just did the groundbreaking just about beginning of May. This project will also become one of the first private off-takers of renewable energy projects within the MSB framework. And this project is also obviously funded through blended financing, both equity and debt financing. And the Development Bank of Namibia is obviously financing the debt financing part of it. I think in conclusion, it's important to just highlight that with our experience, we utilize our extensive experience both in civil and as an EPC contractor in the energy sector to support Namibia as a country and other African government's contribution towards decarbonizing the world. To make this reality, we really need the DFIs or the DFCs to be on board through funding. I'm glad that the banks are also here, Benvindu, Capricorn. It's important that you are part of this process. I think the bottom line to all this is really that the government has got the ambition, it has got the aspiration, and with the policies that are in place, it is committed to bring clean, affordable, secure energy to many homes and businesses for generations to come. And I think as a private sector companies, we must really embrace this and take full advantage of this huge opportunity and make a success of it. This is really a massive opportunity for the country. There is a lot of potential in renewable energy, and I think it's important really that we take advantage of this as private sector companies. So I think I'm done. Thank you very much. So, thank you very much for your kind attention, really, and I'm available to take any questions. Francois, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Kayamo. If I may maybe ask yourself and Director General if you would join us just up front. I think a short Q&A will be in order. So if we can maybe have these mics activated and a roving mic for the floor. Okay, so maybe in the absence of questions from the floor, let's warm the crowd up. So I was wondering, Mr. Kayamo, so given the scale of the opportunity, but also at the same time, the Director General spoke, at length about the potential risk, but also, of course, the limitations of the current legal framework. What do you think is, aside from maybe these points, what do you think is really the major obstacle at this stage for Namibia's private sector to access the market? And how would you go about resolving these particular challenges?
Thank you very much, Francois. I don't think there is any challenges at this stage. I think the frameworks are there. I think as private sector companies, we have to take advantage of those legislation, the policies that are in place for us to tap onto these untapped resources of renewable energy. I think the other issue also that I can mention, probably the one big challenge will probably be the funding aspect of it. I think I've briefly talked about the funding issue, but I think if we can get the DFIs on board to enable private companies to implement some of these projects, especially for the mines. I think us as a company, we have made a number of proposals to various mines that are quite keen to also reduce the cost of the electricity, and therefore they are opting on using renewable energy. So it's important that really we look at that framework and see how we can assist government in reducing the cost of electricity.
Thank you, sir. Honourable Kanjorde, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, indeed. During the period 2015, 16, 17, much of the challenge was the size of the projects to be covered under renewable feed-in tariff projects. The market felt the size of the projects were too small. That's one. So meaning that either that scope would have to change in dimension and move on to 15, 20 maybe, calling for more funding capital. And obviously the risk appetite to banks changes depending on the set conditions. But to government, imagine the size of that country and from one town to the next town, the current infrastructure doesn't actually efficiently and more quickly live up to government's expectation. Electricity is no longer just some privilege. It's a right to any of us. The distances are large. The old transmission transmission networks and their levels of capacity and efficiencies does gobble up quite a number of significant amount of money. In some of the regions in the country, you go for large distances without seeing, some light. Energy poverty is a reality. So funding needs to meet the aspirations of those that keep voting a government in power. They need to meet the conditions of those that the government serves. So I think the aspect of bringing funding to the aspirations of providing that service, there needs to be a coupling of both these commitments so that service delivery, electrification of the region, and the fight against energy poverty can be realized much more quickly. And I think, again, I go back to the banks, the development finance available, and obviously the private sector, and how we can provide a reasonable solution to this plight. For many of as a DG, I took the privilege of actually visiting many of the 121 constituencies. And, in this day and age, 3 decades after independence, the calling is very compelling for government to live out that desire. So we need to tweak the funding aspect, the delivery of power to these issues, and how private sector can actually assist government. I want to go a step further and speak to some of the places that necessarily we need to provide electricity to are not accessible or easily accessible by road. A village called Oshinungwa recently, the president visited, and those that otherwise couldn't make it by helicopter, for 300 kilometers, it took them 10 hours. So it not only speaks to the lack of service at that very spot from an electrification point of view, which in any event it's been electrified. But imagine the citizens in between whatever the point of origin to that destination, along that 360-kilometer line. Much of that, if you are to provide electricity through the conventional, traditional supply networks, through a transmission line, you're going to have to burn quite a lot of capital in between. And yet, the service would only reach pockets of some of the villages. So the challenge is both in that dimension, calls for maybe the risk profile taking without negating profitability, of course, I must add. Also, living up to the aspirations of government in providing that service and fighting all kinds of poverty forms and norms.
Thank you, Director General, for that insightful comment. I think I have a question in the audience here.
Yeah,
you can
hello.
say your name and where you're from. Thank you, please.
Yeah, this is Hans Hermers from Worley. Mr. Kayamo, I have a question in regard to supply chain. Seeing your project, I find that impressive, even if you could say that this is worldwide not the largest projects, but it's impressive that you just go ahead and implement them and build them and start to gain experience in construction and later operation. And just doing it, I think that helps very much to pave the way for other small industries in Namibia also on the learning curve. In your project, when I saw this, I just thought, would you now already feel that here, the supply chain risks? And you said about the cost of the solar and panels and wind turbines. We all know that these have gone down significantly. but on the security of supply of the main parts, but also of smaller electrical parts. And so, do you feel that already, or in your future planning projects? How do you see the situation here?
Thank you very much. I think that's a very important question. No, I think we have recently experienced that in our current project now at Roshpina Zinc Mine. Obviously, you know, with the implementation of the project at Roshpina Zinc Mine, we have seen a significant increase in cost in procuring some of the panels, and this is obviously due to the global demand. That has been a main issue. I think our transport cost has also gone up significantly, but I think we have made contingency plans within our cost proposal to make sure that those risks are factored in. But as you said, rightfully, I think these are some of the things that one has to take into consideration, especially your transport costs and your cost of materials, because you know, sometimes you don't have control over that. We know that we have been importing some of our materials all over the world, and some of them were impacted, obviously, by, if it's not COVID-19, then it's obviously the war in Ukraine. So that has impacted the whole value chain. But obviously, one has to make contingency plans for that. So we have mitigated the risk somehow on this project that we are implementing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kayamo. Maybe if I can ask a follow-up. I think, so when we look at the development of a domestic industry around not necessarily only green hydrogen, but also around renewables generally, how can Namibian companies play a larger role in that supply chain, where we don't end up in a situation where everything all the equipment we use is imported? And at your company, and maybe there's some examples you could mention. So what do you do to kind of make provision for the domestic economy also to participate in these projects?
Yeah, thank you very much, Francois. I think number one, we collaborate quite a lot with Namibian companies, and I take it from the implementation phase. I think this morning I was talking to someone from Altava and List, and they are also quite into renewable energy, and we are keen to cooperate with them on some of the projects. Secondly, during the implementation phase, we use quite a lot of SMEs. In terms of some of them supply us with equipment, some of them supply us with we basically outsource some of the components to our SMEs, and in that way we are also able to plow back into the domestic economy and to be able to also upskill our small and medium enterprises to obviously graduate also from where they are for them to become also fully fledged contractors in the future. So we are definitely working closely with all the SMEs.
Thank you. Director General, it seems that you have something on your mind there.
No.
No?
Not on that.
So maybe this is the last opportunity for questions from the floor.
Or perhaps I say this. The general Namibian have become aware in the last, say, 10 years of what it means to even have a piece of light at your dwelling. When you provide yourself the opportunity and time and just venture in villages, there are really large swaths of our country that remains dark. And although the density per square kilometer is the lowest you can find, still the fact remains somebody lives there. So this in itself is a problem, but an opportunity too. And how that can be solved depends on how the government, public sector, the private sector, and maybe development partners play in that space to provide that service. I find a lot of individuals towards the start and onset of the holiday breaking season, December, December, January. You will find a lot of Namibians who really do some effort and buy some of the outfits themselves and fit it to have at least some form of lighting where they live. And smart grids, standalone, establishment providing that sort of power. Many models have been tried, and most of those do not meet either the repayment capability of whoever the individual, or it's not modeled around, put up a mini grid that supplies a village. The government also provides some funding, I think, in combination with Bank Windhoek, and that has become very popular. Suffice to say, the appetite keeps growing. The funding and solution provisions keep trailing behind. And I think that's an opportune chance for business to look into it, and ever going into the future and looking at green hydrogen and its ability of power to X and the drop in prices in the future, that's an additional opportunity. We could serve that very market, albeit widespread by distance, few individuals who can afford it. But in the meantime, between this project at its conceptual stage before taking shape and making profound difference, there remains a gap to be filled. And government in its policy outlay has already indicated that we want to service that market. Let's call on our players in this room and more to more innovatively look at it and maybe help us provide that solution.
Thank you, Director General. Mr. Kayama?
Yes, Francois, no, I just want to add on to what the Director General has basically commented now. I think the most important thing is really the issue of funding. As a private investor or a private sector company, you could implement 10 of these projects in a row. But the main issue here is really that you will have to almost put part of your equity into the project. As we have done now with Roshpina, banks are not really quite keen, or I'm not sure whether they've got the appetite to take on some of these projects in renewable energy, or whether they are not financially viable from a bank's point of view. I'm not sure how the bank looks at it, but the reality is that there is not really much appetite from the banks. And this is why at times we, as a company, will have to speak to, for example, other DFIs like the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and they are quite keen, to support such infrastructure development. So I think the call here is really, as the Director General said, is that the call is really for the local banks to come on board. I think this is really a huge opportunity for us as a country. It's a huge opportunity for Namibian companies, but without the support of the banks in terms of funding, it will be difficult for us as a country to reach our goals. So in the end, we must look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture is us as a country and as a nation. And we have seen the shortage, the gaps. I think we are importing 60%, over 60% of our energy consumption. So it's really important that we need to bridge that gap. And if the banks can come on board, I think we will have done a lot of success in getting these projects off the ground.
So if I can maybe move the conversation away from funding for a second and talk about, so when you talk about the gap, that we know that in the main that gap is filled by quite expensive electricity, and it's also electricity that we know will escalate in price over the next 3 to 5 years. So a large part of the constraint we have in our economy is due to the lack of domestically produced, or rather generally, of baseload power. And that's, from an industrialization point of view, it's been one of the main points that's kind of held us back. I think, as an organization, as an organization where I work, we certainly deal with investors weekly who have that complaint. So how can the private sector play that role, and at the same time government enable us to do that? Because if we're saying that we want to be a net export country in a number of years, then certainly we need to start that process somewhere. So I don't know, maybe if I can start with the Director General. What is your view on that, and maybe where's the starting point?
We talked extensively around that funding gap. And I think government across sectors understand that gap profoundly well. The availability of perhaps forward-looking policies and liberalization of that market, taking into account the issues at stake in terms of risk definition and how one retains profitability within that risk profile, in enabling just a little bit of opening to allow that sort of funding to happen. Maybe that's one. The Minister of Finance is here. He understands it better than some of us here. So I think that's a calling for how we as a country must look at that. Mind you, we haven't had, for the longest time I remember now, any load shedding in the last 2 years to 3 years. How did we get that right? Yet we are 60% dependent on others. Something in the model just is not adding up. And what do we do in the intervening period as we get supplied by someone else, and whoever supplies us is himself or herself suffering crippling load shedding? So there's a calling for a different model while we are at the mercy of whoever does do something. So there would be a day when the majority supply contract that sits with us today and the main supplier, Nampower, will come to the end of its life. And then what? Green hydrogen would not have done anything by then. There's not added speed from the renewables to try and stave off whatever the future shortfalls may be. You can't tell me sitting in this room that that is not opportunity enough to venture into. Is it government whose policy initiatives are not speaking to the market? I don't believe so. I believe government is more than willing to actually open it all up even further. We fiddled with the Nampower supply model. It's now modified single supplier. We've brought in IPP policy, something that wasn't there 10, 15 years ago. We all depended on, singularly on Nampower. We brought in regional electricity distributors, but there are differential prices in the market today. The one who lives in Keetmans and the one who lives in the north, the pricing profiles are different within the same jurisdiction, country as Namibia. So all of these that we see remains, as we call it in Namibia, low-hanging fruits. Maybe we are just not venturing hard enough to dissect, unpack, and innovatively put in solutions that will speak to the current policy framework and maybe anticipate the change in the market appetite 2-3 years from today, wherein which period whoever supplies us some of the power we have today may be unwilling to do so because their own local circumstances may have changed. I believe there is more than enough that compels business, government, and development partners to actually looking at this surgically and apply a different lens.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Francois. The Director General couldn't have said it any better. The reality is that we are sitting on a time bomb. We are importing over 60%. That's huge. And then the challenge that we have is here is that obviously we can't just be dependent on renewable energies. We need to look at other sources of energy generation. These are really the sources that we need to look at. I mean, the other day I was looking at the UK's energy security strategy. I mean, they've gone in far as even looking at, for example, nuclear power plants. You know, I know in the past it has been a problem. No one wanted to talk about nuclear power plants, but the world is now going back to, because there's better technology. And I think that's the important thing, that we need to start thinking outside the box. You know, we need to look at some of other solutions. And possibly, I'm not saying that we should go back to nuclear power plants. I'm just saying that we should start thinking outside the box. There are really other options. There are really other solutions that we can look at. And we need to start dealing with the issue of reliance on the Southern African power pool. So it is a challenge, but I think we need to start looking at it seriously. I think that discussion between the private sector and the public sector really has to take place as soon as possible.
Gentlemen, I think we've reached the end of our session this afternoon. Thank you very much for your insightful comments. Thank you to our guests here in the house, and thank you to all the viewers and listeners at home. As we see it, if I can maybe wrap up and say, well, I think there's definitely a number of opportunities out there within the energy sector, both in green hydrogen, but also in renewables generally. Of course, plenty of risk, but in the main, many opportunities, not only around funding, but certainly around the deployment of capital within this market. Thank you again for joining us. And yes, if you are interested in our next session, please log off and follow the provided link. Thank you again, and have a good afternoon.